hate to start early in case people show up.
Right, and then they'd say, why did you start early?
Yeah.
Four till.
Well, we're waiting until 7 o'clock. How many people have the Sarah alerts? Sarah alerts?
Sarah, yeah.
Wow, I'm impressed. I'm impressed.
Oh, no, I take that back.
Let's hope we don't need them tonight.
We might as well start this as quiet as this crowd ever gets.
All right, we'll begin. Please silence your phones so we're not interrupted during the presentation. Appreciate that. Let me introduce most worshipful Shaun Bradshaw. Shaun was at one point a Grand Master, and the term worshipful means respected as opposed to worshiping at church. So let me give you a little background on Shaun. He's a proud Masonic esotericist. And let him explain that. Well, he believes in the transformation power of the craft's rituals. He understands, has seen and experienced the value of Freemasonry as both a fraternity and a Western mystery tradition. To that end, he is a passionate promoter of Masonic education in the areas of lodge leadership, administration, and Masonic philosophy. Spends a lot of time around amongst the different lodges in lecturing on Masonry. So without spending a lot of time, I can give you all his credentials, but without spending a lot of time, I'm just going to introduce Shaun. Thank you, Shaun.
Thank you, Bob. We're going to try to not get too much feedback, so I might have to move a little bit here and there so I'm not squealing at you. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. As Bob said, I'm Shaun Bradshaw. I was Grand Master in 2020. We all know what happened in 2020, right? So a lot of people say I got short-shifted out of my year as Grand Master, but let me tell you, I did a lot of work because dealing with a pandemic and social unrest all in 1 year was quite a bit of work for me to have to do. This evening, I was invited to speak to you about Freemasonry as a fraternity. As Bob said, I consider myself a Masonic esotericist, and I'll just briefly explain what that means, because some people freak out a little bit about what that word esoteric means. It does not mean a cult. What it really means is it's open to those of us who have been initiated. So once you become a Freemason and gone through the initiatic rituals that we have, we introduce our members to symbols and rituals that allow them to think about philosophically about themselves. And through that process, our hope is that we as individuals are able to be transformed into better people for our families and our communities. And you know, as I was thinking about what I would talk about this evening, I got to be careful where I go. You know, there's a lot of aspects of the fraternity we could talk about. We could talk about the history, you know, how old it is. We're the oldest fraternity in the world with records that date back to the 14th century. Officially, 1717 was the formation of the First Grand Lodge in England. In North Carolina, our Grand Lodge was formed in 1787. We've been around for a long time, and we've seen a lot of things. I could talk about Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, who were members of our fraternity, and on and on. The history is interesting if you like that kind of thing. That's not my particular interest in the fraternity. I could talk about the degree system and maybe a little bit about why we do the degrees that we do, the entered apprentice, the fellowcraft, and the Master Mason's degree. I could talk about the appendant bodies like the Shrine, the Eastern Star, the Scottish Rite, and the York Rite. I could talk about a lot of different things, but what I think is most important to understand about Freemasonry is really why anyone would ever want to join this fraternity. And so I want to tell you why I joined the fraternity. Would you be open to that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Why is it called free?
Why is it called free? We'll jump right in then. We were going to do Q&A at the end, but I'll answer that.
Thank you.
Historically, so just to give a little bit of history, the fraternity grew out of the stone guilds in during the Middle Ages. And the people who built the cathedrals at the time were stonemasons, so masons. And because they, certain ones of those who had reached a rank and were skilled enough, they were free to move about the country in any way they wanted to do their trades. Not all men had that ability. Some were required to stay in a local presence because they did not have the skills. And so we are called Freemasons because we adapted that language from our ancestors who were Masons from the stone guilds and able to move freely about. Yeah, you're welcome. So let me first tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in 1971. I was born in Cumberland County, North Carolina, Spring Lake, so just outside Fayetteville, if some of you may be familiar with North Carolina. My mother was unwed, so technically I'm a bastard. That's, that by definition, that's what I am. I grew up with my mother and my grandmother. They both raised me during my formidable years. And in 1995, I got married. And my son was born soon after. And when my son Graham was born, I realized that while my mother and my grandmother were wonderful parents, they were not fathers. And I wanted to be the best father I could be to my son. I wanted to be a model of manhood for him. And so I thought, well, where in the world could I find some men who might, hey Brenda, I heard things went well with Ted. I'm glad to hear that. I started looking into, what types of organizations might I find models of manhood that I could become a part of, and hopefully have guys I could turn to and ask questions about raising my son if something came up that I just wasn't sure how to handle. And sure enough, I found the Freemasons. It came up on Google, as things do nowadays, and I found out I had to ask one to be one. And the first guy I asked pretty much ignored me. The second guy I asked is the person I was just speaking to Brenda about, Ted Wright. My college roommate, Chris, had recently moved, and his dad, Ted, and I were helping him move into a new house. And I asked Ted about, I noticed his ring, his Masonic ring, and I thought, I know that symbol. How do I become a Freemason? And man, did he talk. He started going, well, Shaun, let me tell you. And he talked for about an hour. Chris later told me he'd never heard his dad talk so much about the fraternity, which is one of the interesting things. A little side note, there's all this stuff about the secrecy of the fraternity, and some of our members take that secrecy very seriously to the point where they don't even talk about it at all. And so there seems to be more of a mystery about it than there really is for the most part. So I talked to Ted. I ended up joining the fraternity. I joined Stokesdale Lodge 428 and went on about my business, and over time joined other organizations related to the fraternity. And my son grew up, and a few years ago, my son, who was a millennial, you guys know millennials, right? How do millennials communicate?
Text.
They text, exactly. So one night I'm sitting at home and my son sends a text, and it says, "How do I become a Freemason?" And I'm like, well, that requires a little bit more of a discussion than we're going to carry on over text. So I called him, and he said, I said, why are you interested in joining the fraternity? And he said, he said, "You were a good dad." He said, "You're the kind of dad I want to be when I have kids." He said, "And I have been around people my whole life that I knew to be Freemasons, like Ted, like Chris, like Ray Hall, like Gene Llewellyn, Gary Handy, Ben Wallace, etc., etc. All these people that my son had been exposed to because of my membership in this fraternity. And he joined because he wanted to be like them, because he saw something in them, the values, the morals, the behavior that he believed was something that he should pursue in his own life as a man. By the way, he just got married a couple weeks ago, and they're working on having kids. So we'll see how that goes. I might be a granddad in a Grand Master and a granddad at some point in the near future. So that's why I joined the fraternity. Now it also helps that I do like philosophy, and it's interesting to me how our symbols, which some of you probably are very familiar with, and some of you have seen and may not have a clue, but it's very interesting to understand how we use in the fraternity, how we use these symbols to speak to us individually as a means of allowing us to really get to understand who we are as individuals and our place in the world and what God actually has in store for us, what He wants us to do with our time and effort. The square and compasses, for example, we see that all the time. The square reminds us to walk uprightly in our several stations before God and man. Basically, to the golden rule, to always be the best person you can be. The compasses are used to circumscribe circles and plan out, or sort of. You got the ritual, the lecturers in here are like freaking out because I'm not doing it, but that's okay. But to basically see how the planet and the stars move in space, and what that really symbolizes is the grander scheme, the grander plan of all the things in our lives that you want to plan out, but you don't always have the ability to. And so there's this idea of who we are here today and the plans we have for our future and what we want to be or how we want the world to look, and the work that we do to be able to affect that change. When we close a lodge, we have a benediction. May brotherly love prevail and every moral and social virtue cement us. And I love to call attention to the brethren. We say these words all the time, but we don't always hear them, that it's the social and moral virtues. It's not just what's applicable in society today, but morally, what's inside you, the foundation that you have that drives that better behavior. And of course, the fraternity gives us opportunities to be and express our social virtues through the charities, like some of the charity work we do here at Whitestone, and of course, the Masonic Home for Children. So that's why I joined the fraternity, because I wanted to be the best father I could be. And my son proved, whether I thought I did a good job or not, he proved to me that I was right to join, because he wanted to be like me and the other men that he saw. Now, can I share one other story with you? How many of you believe in providence? Providence. The hand of God at work in our lives. Okay. So I mentioned that I was a bastard. What? A bastard. Technically, because I grew up without a father. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean I didn't know who my father was. He wasn't dead. My mother and my father were never married. But I knew who my dad was. I had a good friend several years ago, Dave Kuntz, who was a member of course, the fraternity, but also the SAR, the Sons of the American Revolution, and he loved to do genealogical work. And he said, Shaun, I'd love to do your genealogy. Well, I knew what he really wanted to do was get me in the SAR, because he just wanted to find a patriot in my history. And I said, sure, David, I'd be happy to help you in any way I can, but you're going to need to work on the Bradshaw side of the family, my mother's side of the family, because I really don't know my dad's side. I could give you a name, and that's about it. Don't know anything else about him. He said, we'll work on Bradshaws. Well, no, you couldn't work on the Bradshaws. The Bradshaws love to move back and forth between Georgia and North Carolina every generation or so. He said, it's too hard to track. Let's see what we can do on your dad's side of the family. So I spoke to my mom, and I said, Mom, what can you tell me about my dad besides his name? I know his name. Buddy Davis, Willard Davis was his name, but everybody called him Buddy. And she gave me a few little details, and the one thing she told me was he was a vice principal in Craven County. Okay? Y'all know where Craven County is? I'm sure a few of you. New Bern. My mom told me that on a Friday night. Saturday morning, I show up at the Masonic Temple in Greensboro. There is one person in this entire state I know who used to work in the education system in Craven County. That one person that I know, some of you know him, happened to be in Greensboro that morning. Providence. His name is Billy Dill. I went up to him at lunch and I said, Billy, do you happen to know a guy by the name of Buddy Davis? And he said, yeah, the name's familiar. He was sick, wasn't he? Didn't he die? I didn't know. But that night, I went home, again, Google, there's our friend, and I Googled the obituary for Buddy Davis. And my father had passed away about 3 months earlier. And as I'm reading through the obituary, here's what I saw. Brian Davis had conducted the funeral. Now, the last name Davis is pretty common, but I was still pretty confident that Brian might be a relative. I learned that my father's brother, Robert, was still alive. I learned that my grandparents were still alive. And I learned that my dad was a Freemason in New Bern. A couple days later, I took a day off work. I drove down to New Bern. I met Billy. Billy took me to the school where my father had been vice principal. I got to meet the principal. I got to see the doll that the children had written well wishes on for him to get better. But brain cancer, especially as bad as what he had, it's not always going to go into remission. I talked with Billy. I got pictures from Billy of my father from when he went through the fraternity. I got to see where my father lived. It was a really nice time. I had to get a death certificate for David because we're doing a genealogy, right? So I take care of the formalities and then I head home. And as I'm driving home from New Bern to Greensboro, I pass a sign and it says Smithfield. I'm like, now that's where my grandparents lived. According to the obituary, my grandparents were in Smithfield. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to be bold. God has led me to this point so far. Let me see how far I can take it. And I called the funeral home that did my father's funeral. And I said, do you have a number for Brian Davis? And you know what? They did, and they gave it to me. And I called it. Now, when people call you that you don't recognize their number, do you answer?
No.
You know what Brian did?
He answered.
He answered the call.
Oh.
And I talked to my cousin. And I said, Brian, you don't know me, but I'm Shaun Bradshaw. I'm Buddy's son. And his response was, well, there was a rumor. They knew about me. And I said, Brian, I'm not far outside Smithfield. Do you think my grandparents would be willing to see me? And he said, let me give them a call. And he called them. And a few minutes later, he called me back and he said, yeah, they'd be happy to see you. He gave me the address. I put it in the GPS. 15 or so minutes later, I was pulling into a gravel driveway in a center block house no bigger than this room. I got out of the car and my grandfather comes out to greet me. He shakes my hand and gives me a big hug. I literally spend the whole evening. I spent the night there talking to them, learning about my father. They learning about me. And the one thing that just really sticks in my mind is I finally knew where I got my personality. Because growing up, everybody has a little uniqueness to their personality. And I was not like my grandmother, and I was not like my mom, but damn it, I was like my grandparents. I saw it in them. That's who I was. And we connected just like that. And I thought, this is providence working in my life. A few months later, I was telling somebody about this story. And as I was relating it to them, I realized that they had just lost a son. My grandparents had lost their son just a few months before I showed up at their doorstep. And I realized that providence was working for them as much as he was for me. That I was there for them because they needed Buddy. And even if it was just my laugh, even if it was just my personality, that's what they got. A part of him back. Because that's what they needed. Now think back to the beginning of that story. If it weren't for my membership in this fraternity, I wouldn't have known David. I would have had nobody ask me about my genealogy. I wouldn't have known Billy Deal. I wouldn't have known someone who actually had a connection to my father. I probably would have never met my grandparents. And they wouldn't have had the chance to meet me. So what does this fraternity mean to me? Yeah, it means a lot of, fancy symbols and pins and titles, and there's all that. That's ancillary. But the real value to me is family. It's the brothers that helped me raise my son to the point where he wanted to be a part of us also. He wanted what this fraternity has for him. The fraternity helped me reconnect with a part of my family I wouldn't have known otherwise. So forget about all the conspiracy theories That's a bunch of BS. The real fraternity is about men connecting to one another, being there for one another, helping each other, sometimes not even knowing the path that we're putting each other on. Because I guarantee you, David Kuntz had no idea when he asked me that question that the result would be the reconnection with my father's family. So that's my story. That's why I joined. And I hope what I have done, while I didn't express any particular secrets, if you want to know something, I'm happy to answer questions, like the Freemasonry, the name. At this point, I'm happy to take your questions, if you have any. Yeah.
Why do Masons wear those funny hats? Does it have a meaning?
So we got a lot of funny hats. We might have to be more different.
Why hats that sit up high?
That's the shrine.
Yeah.
The shrine.
The shrine.
That's the shrine.
That's the Shriners. So yeah, the red fez, which is associated with the shrine, it's a little bit interesting because, and this might get a little technical, but the shrine is not part of Freemasonry except that they want us to be. And basically what that means is the Shriners have decided that they want their members to have the basic moral values of Freemasons, and so they only accept applicants who are Freemasons. Now they wear the red fez because the whole theme of their the original work that they did is based on the theater that came out of the Middle East, and so it plays into, you know, you got the shrine temples and there's this Middle Eastern feel to it, and so they use the Moroccan fez in that color as part of their garments that they.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. We fully moved here 2 weeks ago.
Oh, congratulations.
And my husband is very ill, and
I'm
we
sorry.
are very grateful that we got in here. But when we were cleaning our house, I came upon a Life magazine, and the cover was about the Masons.
Yes.
And it had a picture of all these Masons with the fez and the black hat. And I put it somewhere to bring. I have no idea where anything is, but I will find it sometime. And it was so fascinating because if you remember Life and Look, they were large magazines, and they were mostly pictures. So if I find it, I will put it in the library for people to see.
Very good. So an interesting little anomaly that happened in our fraternity relatively recently was prior to World War II, we were a pretty small group. In North Carolina in the 19th century, there weren't more than 3,000 Masons in the whole state. But because of World War II, all the GIs wanted to join something, and most of them joined our fraternity. And so in North Carolina, we exploded to almost 80,000 members by 1980. And that explosion happened all over the United States. And as a result, we got a lot more attention back then than we did in the earlier days. Gene, I saw you raise your hand, and I saw a hand right here.
I didn't have a question. I was just going to say I've got a copy of that Life magazine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And
Very good.
pocket.
Very good. And I saw.
You all have a lot of things called degrees.
We do.
And my father was a 32nd degree Mason. He was in it for over 70 years, but I have no idea what that means.
And you'd like me to explain them? 1 through 32.
Yeah,
Sure. Sure. Why not? Why not? So the degrees are interesting, and can I get a little philosophical with you? Because to me, the degrees have a philosophical bent to them. The degrees utilize ritual and symbols to help us both provide some different ways of looking at your life and in your place in this world. The first degree is called the entered apprentice degree because, remember, we came from the stonemason guilds. We used the language as though we are in a guild. So you have an entered apprentice. My son's an electrician now, so he's an apprentice electrician. One day he'll become a journeyman, but we call it fellowcraft in our work. That's the second degree. And then once he becomes a master electrician, that would be like our third degree, Master Mason's degree. And each of those degrees has a ritual and a set of symbols that go with it, that in the first degree is aimed particularly at teaching you about who you are and who you aren't. In fact, one question we ask a lot is, who comes here? And ritualistically we have an answer, but the reality is we're asking, who are you? Have you really thought about who you are and your place in this world? And we talk about what you should be doing with your life, how you should think about your place, not just with your family or work, but the world as a whole, how you should treat other people. We have 3 principal tenets which are described in that first degree: brotherly love, relief, and truth. We talk about in brotherly love that we should treat all people with equal regard, sort of the golden rule. With relief, another way to think about that is the charitable work that we do. But not just charity and giving money, but giving of your time, giving of an ear to someone who needs help, who needs someone to talk to. And then truth, when we talk about truth, we're not talking necessarily about fact versus fiction, but that greater truth that God provides to us, the truth of who you are and what you need to be doing in your life. You won't learn that in any degree. You have to learn that on your own, but what we do is we provide you symbols that if you contemplate may give you some insights. The second degree is one that's geared more towards, if you think about that stonemasons guild analogy, you know, an entered apprentice is learning the basics, right? And then at some point you've got to learn like all the rules of the road. You know, my son has that big thick code book for electricians. At some point he's going to have to know that whole thing. Well, in Freemasonry we talk about during the second degree or fellowcraft's degree about all the different knowledge that you need to acquire, particularly those of grammar, rhetoric, logic, astronomy, help me out, arithmetic, geometry, and music, the 7 liberal arts and sciences. Because when we have knowledge, we have the potential for wisdom. We move away from ignorance. And again, because I'm a philosophical Mason, I tend to think about ignorance as my own personal ignorance, not the ignorance that exists in the rest of the world. What do I have to overcome? Then the third degree, we present a bit of a problem. And I can't go into too much detail, but there are aspects of our lives, of our personalities that we each have to deal with. For some of us, that might be pride. For some, it may be ignorance. For some, it may be anger. For others, it may be greed. And it might pop up here and there in our lives. And it has a tendency, if you let it overcome you, it can really hurt. And we use a part of the ritual in the third degree to teach the lesson that even though sometimes those bad personality traits we all have may overcome us, we can still rise above them and come back and try again to be who we really are. So that's the 3. The 32 is part of the Scottish Rite. We'll take that offline. That's a longer discussion. There's a lot of cool degrees in that. But they all boil down to those same principles. Good question.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sorry, but I have a lot of questions.
If they don't care, I don't care.
Okay. With the world the way it is right now,
Yes.
and I mean, I have 2 sons. One is 50 and one is 45. And they work all the time.
Yes.
And they have families.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the internet, which started in the 90s, I think, and because of work requirements, they are basically on duty 24 hours a day, and they work with people in the Middle East, China, all over the world. So there is a real problem in our country. And my husband was in Rotary, and Rotary is a fine organization, but they are not getting new members. And the reason why they're not getting new members is young men in the age of my children have to work all the time. And then when they have a little free time, or they make time, they spend it with their family,
Yes.
which is really important. Go to church, Bible study. So there's very little time for social organizations. How are the Masons handling that?
That is a fantastic question, because it actually goes to the root of one of the issues that we have today, and that is, where do our members come from? And there are a lot of young guys who are not able to commit the amount of time that they believe the fraternity requires. Now, the reality is there is some time commitment necessary. But a lot of people see people like me and some of the other brothers in here and how much we do. And I have, I have been blessed in my life. I have a company that I'm able to basically take the time that I need for some of this stuff. And I have a very open a family that's very open to what I have done, as I've described with my son. And of course, my wife is very much on board with all this. Not everybody's going to be in that position, and as such, won't necessarily have the ability to commit to it. The thing is about our fraternity is we never ask people to join. We never ask someone to join. And here's why. Because we believe that our fraternity is intended to help men understand themselves. And I can't go up to someone and say, Ray, you seem like a pretty decent guy, but you got some flaws. And you know what? Freemasonry could help you out.
We thought so too.
You can't do that. Right? He has to understand at some point that Freemasonry might have something he needs in his life. So there's a little bit of a struggle, right? The struggle is, if you're not going to ask people to join, how are they going to come in? Well, one thing we need to do is at least let them know that we exist. And so that's part of the reason I like to get out and speak. It's not to ask anyone to join, but to set right the ideas that are out there, just so you understand who we are and why we exist. And then if you're compelled, if you see something in particularly the people who are already members, then just like my son asked me, maybe you would ask them, because you see something in them that you also want. So maybe they haven't joined because they're busy, or maybe they haven't joined because they don't know anybody that's a Freemason.
And their grandfather was a Freemason in Hickory, very active,
Yes.
and he built a special desk that I understand is still in the Mason meeting place. I've
Oh,
never
okay.
seen it.
Yeah.
But he has a relative that was Mason.
Yes.
But we don't know anything about it until
Yes.
tonight.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for the questions. Does anybody else have anything? Burning
I got one
questions?
of them.
Please
You know,
go.
yesterday, Ray did this absolutely magnificent job at a funeral.
Mhm.
And I thought to myself, and he had it all memorized. And somebody told me that everything that you all do in ritual jargon is memorized.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, well, heck, I'm almost 85 years old. How in the name of Sam Hill would I be able to memorize anything? I mean, I have enough trouble with names now at my age.
I'm terrible with names, and yet I was still able to memorize this stuff. So there's two parts to that. Not every state is the same. In North Carolina, we do require certain parts of our ritual, we call them catechisms, to be memorized in order to progress from one degree to another. Not every state has that same requirement. I believe Virginia has a shorter version of that. And some states don't require it at all. They just ask you to read a little bit and then show proficiency. But the interesting thing is you're not on your own. Part of the reason we do this, we call it learning mouth to ear. And part of the reason that we do that and require men to memorize it is not just so the words are kind of in your head, but so you have an opportunity to talk to someone who's got a little more knowledge at least than you do. So as you're learning the words, it's not just about which word goes where. Is it which or that or will or shall? But what does it mean? What might it mean to you in your life? How do you feel about it? How has that particular part of the ritual changed or made the person you're working with, your mentor or coach, how has it affected them? That's creating that connection is extraordinarily important in what we do. And it helps bring that new member into and a part of our lodge. Without the requirement of memorization, my fear is that we would lose part of that connection with each other. But I think if you put your mind to it a little bit, and you seem pretty sharp to me for almost 85, I think you could get it if you wanted.
They do the same thing for Eastern Star?
No, Eastern Star does not require a catechism, but if you're a man, in order to join the Eastern Star, you must be a Mason.
I wasn't looking to be an Eastern Star.
Well, yeah. But you asked about it, so I thought I'd throw that in there. A little bit of a plug for the local church.
Well, I dropped in at an Eastern Star meeting Saturday because in our newsletter it said we had exercise in this room. And I dropped in, and there were a nice group of ladies, some of them over there, sitting in a circle, and they were having a meeting. And I said, well, where's the exercise? I said, it's not here. They don't have it on Saturday. I said, well, it says they have it on Saturday from 10 to 11 in the General Assembly Fellowship Room. Well, they said, it's not here. And I said, do you mind if I sit down and just listen to your meeting? So I barged in. They were real nice. And I sat down, and I listened, and I participated. I don't think they like that. But I do know that now the Eastern Star, wherever that one is, they are going to have a Christmas program for the residents here in December. And we have that to look forward to, and it's going to be very special on a Sunday with music, and they are working real hard on it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
So I learned some things. And so after I learned those things and I realized I was irritating, I decided I'd go to swimming. So I go to swimming, which is on the schedule. There's nobody in the pool. You can't get in the pool unless you have a partner.
Oh, okay.
So I just went to the gym. So anyway, it was very interesting. But I'm glad. I'm sorry for these that I irritated you. But I had some valid questions. So anyway, they were very nice ladies. And they were trying really hard to present a nice program for December.
Very good. Very good.
Christmas at Whitestone.
Christmas at Whitestone.
December 3rd.
December 3rd, Christmas at Whitestone. Eastern Star will sponsor that. Are there other questions or comments?
Talk about the 33rd degree.
Oh, sure. So I've mentioned that once you become a Freemason, certain organizations exist which either allow you to join, which is like the Shrine, or as a Freemason you are permitted to apply for. which one of those is called the Scottish Rite, and that's where the 32nd degree comes from. There's a whole series of additional degrees. The 33rd degree is an honorary degree, which is given to a very small number of men in our organization. That degree is based, or I should say, men are invited to have that honor based on the work that they've done in the fraternity. So having exemplified, some leadership in the fraternity, or leadership in the community, or having done some other special or significant thing that helps improve the world. And we have some 33rds in here right now. I'm looking at a few as I scan across the room. I happen to be a 33rd, and it's a very high honor. It is another degree. The lessons that are taught in it are not that different from what we receive in the 3rd degree. The allegory that's given is different because it just uses a different story, if you will, and some slightly different symbols, which, if I can, I'll just add this. In the Eastern Star, in the Scottish Rite, the York Rite, the Shrine, each one has its own set of rituals that it uses and symbols. And this is important to understand. The reason we use rituals and symbols is because when you're talking about philosophy and truth, the big T truth, not fact or fiction, everybody has to kind of come to that on their own. We all start with different levels of knowledge, right? Different understandings of the world or ourselves. And we use these symbols because the symbol can speak to you in a way that you understand that doesn't necessarily have to be explained by someone else. Now, we can give a basic explanation of them, but the real intent is that you will spend a little bit of time thinking about what that symbol means in your life, how you act. Can I share one more story? Sure. Speaking of symbols. And this is in the written work, so I can talk about this. One of the symbols of the entered apprentice degree is the 24-inch gauge. And we're told that the 24-inch gauge is divided into 3 sections, whereby we find 8 hours for our usual avocation, so work, 8 for devotion to God and helping other people, and then 8 for refreshment and sleep. So it's a really nice way to kind of keep your life in balance, right? The symbol's laid out in a way that 24 hours a day, 24 inches, how should I spend my time? We had a brother, at the time he became a brother, who went through the entered apprentice degree, and a lot of guys join the fraternity, and then what happens, Ray?
They never come back.
They never come back. They never come back. They stay members, they continue to pay their dues, but they never come back to any of the meetings. And I bumped into this guy a couple, maybe 3 or 4 years later at a Boy Scout camp. I'm sorry, a Cub Scout camp. My kids were in the Scouts, his kids were in the Scouts, and I saw him and I said, Jim, it's good to see you. What you been up to? Hadn't seen you at Lodge. And he said, well, you know what? When I went through that degree, and they showed me the 24-inch gauge, it got me to thinking right in that moment, how was I spending my time? And he said, I was a member of, talking about Rotary, I was a member of Rotary, and I was joining this organization, and the Lions, and the Freemasons, and this thing, and I'm, he's a general contractor, and he's gone and doing this and all these things, and he realized in that moment, he had no time for his children. And he decided, because of the 24-inch gauge, he needed to realign how he spent his time. And so he became not a scoutmaster, but like an assistant scoutmaster, so he could spend time with his kids. That's the type of thing. Now, I didn't get the same lesson out of the 24-inch gauge, at least not in the same way that he did. But that's interesting, and that's part of the reason we use those symbols. Gene, I saw you raised your hand.
You mentioned providence. I will relate something that I dealt with, I think, along the same lines. I had a couple of neighbors, one on either side, and both of them were Masons. And one of them was about like a father image, but I never got involved in Masonry until our daughter was out of high school and was going away to college. And I look back on that, and I think that was providence in that I never missed a PTA meeting.
Right.
I never missed a dance recital, a piano recital. And a lot of things, if I had got involved in Masonry, as involved as all of us have been that are still in Masonry, I would have probably missed some of that. And that's not good. And that's what we don't want to encourage anybody to join, because family comes first.
In fact, we tell them that's part of we have a charge. At the end of the charge, we tell them that the fraternity should not interfere with your duties at work or your family, that those things come first, but we're here for you if you want.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
I have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is, how do the Masons interrelate with people who are Masons in states other than theirs?
Okay. So that's a good question. That's a little bit of a technical question. So every state in the United States has its own what's called a grand jurisdiction or grand lodge that oversees the legitimacy of the members that are affiliated with it. And so if I want to talk to someone who is in Kentucky, which I did recently, there are mechanisms for me to either go through my Grand Lodge or his Grand Lodge to ensure that he is legitimate. There are, unfortunately, illegitimate Freemasons. I was at a lodge one time, this was a few years ago, and we were about to start some degree work, and a brother had to step outside. And when he came back in, a couple of guys came in with him. Now, everybody in the lodge room assumed that he had confirmed that they were legitimate Freemasons. And apparently, when he went out, he had assumed that the person who was already out there had confirmed that these guys were legitimate Freemasons. Well, guess what? They weren't. Because when they introduced themselves, the name and number of the lodge they gave was not one that anybody recognized. And so we had to ask them to step out.
Why would they even want to do that?
To be honest, they did not know. They joined what's called a clandestine lodge, and they did not realize, they wanted to be legitimate Freemasons, but they didn't realize they had joined a group that was not recognized.
So do you recognize, do all Masons across the country have the benefits of wherever they are, even if they became a Mason in an off-state?
Mm-hmm.
They do?
Yes, we do. There are certain specific rights that every Mason has when they travel, one of which is the right of visitation, as long as it is a recognized.
And then if they move there?
They are considered legitimate, and they are welcome to apply to join a lodge locally, yes.
So the other question I have is, what is your policy and thought process around women being in Masons?
That's a really good question.
What was the question?
What's the policy and thought process behind women being in the Freemasons? Okay, so let's go back in history just a little bit. One of the requirements that the Freemasons have is, well, let me talk about some of the requirements. You have to have a belief in God. You have to be of a certain age. In North Carolina, that age is 18. You have to be, quote, free-born. And then there's a well-recommended and etc. So basically a good person with recommendations. When the Freemasons first started, women did not enjoy the same rights that they have today. And in fact, whatever you want to think about it now, they were not free-born. They had no agency over themselves and their own lives. And for an organization that is created or was created to allow people to improve themselves, it was at the time just thought, well, women don't have that ability, so they don't even need to be a part of it. Now, this is where it gets a little sticky because we live in a different era. We live in a different time. And don't be surprised when I tell you there are women Freemasons. There are lodges in the United States that women can join. And only women. There are lodges in the United States that have both men and women. Now, because of our history, because of the way we recognize different jurisdictions, we do not intermingle. The women Freemasons do not come to the men's lodges and the men do not go to the women's lodges, but they exist. So a woman actually can become a Freemason, and she would enjoy the same rights and privileges within her jurisdiction and the ability to
Are there any lodges that have both men and women?
There are. Those are called co-masons, and while there's not a lot of them, but they do exist. New York has a few, and similar to the women Masons organizations, they are not recognized by our Grand Lodge, so there's no intervisitation. One of the lodges I belong to actually did invite a co-Mason, a woman, Karen Kidd, to come and speak because she's an historian, and so she had a really interesting talk. Now, we didn't share any secrets, quote-unquote secrets, any aspects of our ritual or the signs and do-guards and the secret handshakes that people always freak out about. We didn't share any of that, but we talked about history, which was very interesting.
So is there any movement about bringing women into Masons?
No, probably not.
So if a Mason came today and a woman came today with a recommendation from another Mason and wanted to join whoever meets here, I don't know which lodge meets here, she could not join?
She would not be permitted to join. Although if she really wanted to be a Freemason, I can tell you who to go to. I can introduce you to the former master of American George Lodge.
So Jerry, if I could just have one more question, I'll be quiet. I know he wants to ask a question.
Yeah.
And so you said they must believe in God.
Yes.
And that's a good thing in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But do they also have to believe that Jesus is the Son of God?
There's no requirement that you be a Christian. So we do have Jewish Masons in North Carolina. We do have Muslim Masons in North Carolina. We have some who don't profess any particular or align with any particular sectarian belief, but they do have a belief in God. Now, it used to be in ancient times that whatever the state religion was, you had to be of that state religion. But prior to that 1717 date, a couple of guys got together, particularly one, his last name was Anderson, and he wrote what's now known as Anderson's Constitutions. And they thought, I don't want to go into too much detail, but there was a big shift in movement and religious beliefs at the time, particularly between France and England, and they're like, you know what? If you're not Church of England, or you're not Catholic, or you're one or the other, let's just all get along, and we'll let you in, as long as you're a good man.
Too bad they can't think that way about women.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
okay.
So can I speak philosophically? Yes. Okay. So remember why I joined the fraternity was to be a father.
Right.
And so there are some, and I have mixed. I'll be honest. I have mixed feelings about this. I think my mother and my grandmother raised me, and I feel like they did a really good job. And so I feel like I benefited from that. But there are a lot of people still today who believe that being able to have a place where men can mingle together without, and don't take this the wrong way, without the distraction of women. And I say that because particularly, and I'm not trying to put women down, I'm actually talking about men's inability to stay concentrating on what they're talking about, that sometimes the presence of women becomes distracting to men. I mean, we've probably all been there, right? And so having this place where men can mingle together, and and not just enjoy each other's company, but to talk about manhood and what it means to be a man is still very important to a lot of guys. And so for that reason, I don't think we will shift away from that policy.
That's your best argument,
Maybe so. I don't know. Again, I have some mixed feelings about that. I know some co-masons and I know some women masons. I do not talk in any way that would get me in trouble regarding the obligations I've taken. But I believe they're good people. I believe that they have joined an organization that they get some value out of, and I'm very thankful for it.
We'll let someone else speak and have about 5 more minutes.
5 minutes, okay.
All right, you made reference a while ago to be a Mason, you had to be born free.
Yes.
Is that left over from the slavery days, or is that applied now? What does it mean now?
That's a really good question, and it actually predates slavery. As I mentioned, our fraternity comes out of the Middle Ages, so it predates at least our conception of slavery. So it was impacted by anyone who might be in any type of indentured servitude or unable to have agency over their lives. So as times went on, it did include slavery. As a result, historically, black men who had been slaves were not permitted to join lodges. Eventually, though, a separate jurisdiction of predominantly black Freemasons grew up in the United States. It's called Prince Hall. In North Carolina, we recognize our Prince Hall brothers, and as of today, we have very close relations with them. Not only that, but in our Grand Lodge, we have plenty of black guys in our lodges, and they have white guys in their lodges. So as time passed, it has changed considerably, but it's I would say, a historical anomaly because of slavery and because of that particular point, yes.
Well, in ancient Egypt and other countries, you didn't have to be black to be a slave.
This is true.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
did the same rule apply?
It did, yes. It applied in both instances, similar to why women weren't permitted to join in the early days. That's one of the interesting points that Karen Kidd, I mentioned as a co-mason, that she brought up is, in fact, there have been women Masons over time for a variety of different reasons, but what kept them out of the fraternity originally was because they didn't have agency over their lives. Yeah. At that time.
Oh, yeah, okay. I was gonna say,
Yeah, at that time.
She rose to...
Of course, today is completely different. 100%.
Time for one more question.
Okay. Yes.
To be a Mason, must you also believe in the immortality of the soul along
Yes.
with the one God?
Yeah, that is part of the belief. Yes.
Yes, I think.
Mhm.
And what do you mean by immortality of the soul?
Well, now we're getting into deep philosophy, aren't we?
I want to know.
That there is a part of us, everyone in this room, I believe, I can only speak to my belief, but my belief is that everyone in this room, every human has a part of themselves that is also connected to God. And we generally refer to that as our soul. And at some point, our soul will return to its source, whatever conception you have. Now, that's my own personal opinion. I'm not speaking on as an authority of Freemasonry in that. Everybody, any Freemason in here can have their own conception. Some who are Christians may have a very specific definitions or a sectarian definition for it, but that's how I generally apply that concept.
Shaun, you know, and I'm not trying to wrong thing, but those who heard my funeral service Saturday,
Yes.
There is a part in that funeral service where I said that there is an immortal part within us which survives the grave and which shall never, never, never die.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shaun.
Awesome. Wow, this was great. Thank you so much. Bob, thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be with all of you. I'll stick around for a few more minutes, turn the mic off, so if you want to talk a little bit more without it being broadcast, we can do that as well. But thank you. Thanks.
Very good. Trying to fall down on me. it up. Got a little cookie.
You were at the start.
Somebody step up.